Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time of day you're watching this video. This is the ultra super fast video at 10 to 20 times regular speed. I spent about 48 seconds talking about it on a previous cut, but we're going to go faster than that. We're going to go on to the next slide now. So we're going to go through chapters 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26 of Unit 6 in this video. We're going to go very fast, over 74 slides, aiming for 20 seconds per slide, and super fast. Okay, in order to get this whole video under 20 minutes, that's our goal if possible, we're going to go very fast. So that means you have to get ready with your finger on your pause button to pause to read some of these slides, because we're not going to read every word if there's some information you need to see. If you've saved your notes from Unit 2 on Aristotle, make sure you go over and read your notes specifically about ethics so you can compare the other philosophers and their moral ethical models with Aristotle's virtue ethics. Okay, so from our textbook, you can see there's a quote at the bottom of this. It says, the best way to develop good habits is to practice them from an early age. You practice these good habits to build character, to get good at having habits that lead to the correct emotions, which will guide you into the correct virtues. So you will have the right amount of courage, not too timid, and not too foolhardy. Aristotle thought that every virtue lies in a balance between extremes, and the emphasis is on building character, which will result in greater happiness and eudaimonia. Eudaimonia being the Greek word for a type of happiness. So eudaimonia is a satisfied type happiness that is acquired after accomplishing time. After you accomplish things over time, you feel deeply satisfied that you have built a good character and accomplished good things. Okay, pause here if you want to read the slide. This is the super fast video. So Aristotle's emphasis on virtue and being virtuous has some crossover connections to psychology, specifically cognitive behavior psychology and identity-based motivation and identity-based change. Google these topics if you're interested in this crossover. Now we're moving on to Kant and Kantian ethics, also known as deontology. Deontology means study of duty or duty-based ethics, and Kantian ethics is about duty plus intent, where the intent is to follow logical, rational principles, rules that have their grounds in logic, not necessarily emotion, and not necessarily religion, and not consequences such as consequentialism or utilitarianism. In chapter 19 of our textbook, we're going to learn about the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. Simply put, in very simply phrased words, basically the phenomenal world is the world that we can perceive and understand in our mind logically, where there's something beyond that called the noumenal world. And now there is, you could divide the noumenal world hypothetically into the physical and the abstract, but this is a simplification for this fast video. So Kant used this word called filter, and now I wear glasses. You can see that I have these glasses. If I take off my glasses, my perception of the world changes, and now if these were colored glasses, they would shape the colors as well. So imagine we all have these type of glasses that have perception changing lenses and colors and things that shape our reality. And so how we see and describe and interpret and store reality in our minds is going to be different than somebody else's perception and how they label symbols in their mind. Also, imagine if you're wearing swimming goggles, and as your goggles cross the break of the water and you reach for a particular seashell or stone, you kind of miss it with your hands because what you see is light refracted by the glasses and the light in the water, and so something shifts in your perception of reality is mistaken. Okay. Synthetic knowledge requires experience or observation that gives us new information, something that is not just contained in the meaning of words or symbols. Example, discussing a food item that you have tasted. You cannot do it without actually really tasting that food, at least not do it very usefully. A priori means an assertion made before examination or substantiation. Latin, from beforehand, or information from what becomes from before. Okay, now we're going to transition from chapter 19 to chapter 20. Immanuel Kant is the founder of transcendental idealism. The school of thought argues that, while objective reality exists, human beings can only ever experience and understand the world through the organizing filters of the human mind. So, Kant uses this word phenomenal to refer to the world that we can experience, and noumenal, the world that we cannot fully understand through experience. He's not doing this in isolation, but he's doing this in context and connection to other ideas he has. He's thinking about free will, objective reality, and the dissonance between deterministic physics and free will. In order to wrap our heads around this complex concept, let's try to use a very simplified metaphor to help us to understand something. So imagine that there is a planet that we want to go to, and we maybe know that there is a valley where we want to land our spaceship there, but no human has ever been to this planet. And our information about this planet and this valley is very, very limited. And perhaps it's so limited that we know almost nothing. Now, if our human perception is so incredibly limited that we know nothing or almost absolutely nothing, does that mean that this planet and its valleys are now subjective? Or do they exist in a world that is noumenal, where they exist somewhere, but we can't perceive that? This is a simplified example to help us understand this concept, that there is something out there objective that we cannot necessarily perceive. Perhaps in the future I will fly to Venus and perceive things that have not yet been perceived with my own senses. But if you know the science of Venus, that's very, very, very unlikely. Okay, now we're going to tackle a big question. What are the keys to moral action according to Kant? Probably the first three are the good ones for the simplified version, but we can expand it a little further. But it's going to take a little bit of time over several slides. Here we go. First of all, let's take a look at the yellow in this slide here from the textbook. It's not just about what you do, but why you do it. So intention is important. It has to be based on reason. Reason is the right intention. So you've looked at the logic. You've come to a logical conclusion that you should do this. Not based on feeling, which is avoiding or gaining some emotion, or not based on gaining or avoiding some sort of physical action like prison. Kant thought emotions should not come into it. So I'm not doing it to avoid guilt or gain a sense of generous feelings. Okay, here we go. Sum it up. Kant thought emotion should not be part of morality. Kant believed that morality is about doing your logical duty regardless of your emotions. Doing a moral action for the intention of a logical moral duty is good. However, doing a moral action for any hope of reward or positive emotion would just be trying to get something. Number 3, there is a logical moral truth or code that is more important than outcome. For example, one should never lie regardless of the outcome. Now, hopefully all students can understand and explain those first 3 points. Now it's going to get a little bit more complicated with point number 4. Kant arrives at rules called duties called catechal imperatives by using logic. For example, I do not believe that a rule exists for other people that stealing is okay. I do not want people to steal my stuff. I do not want to make a rule that everybody should steal all the time, because I do not like that idea that everybody should steal all the time and everybody should steal my stuff all the time. I can make a rule that's the opposite of that, that nobody should steal, or everybody should leave other people's stuff alone and respect people's stuff. No stealing. That's the plan. All right. Because I can make that kind of a rule that's logical, based on the logical of I do not want people to steal my stuff, and it becomes universalizable that all people should not steal. This is a universalizable maxim, and therefore should be considered a rule or duty called a catechal imperative. Now, this is trying to get to the idea of this rule that you should not steal, based on logic. Now, this is opposed to the alternatives, which is thou shalt not steal because God told you to not steal, or emotions, you should not steal because you will feel guilty. Those are not what Kant is going for. Kant believed that morality was about categorical imperatives, not the hypothetical imperative. Hypothetical imperatives take the form of if you want X, do Y. If you want to avoid X, do Z. If you want to avoid prison, do not steal. Not morality. This is not morality according to Kant. Kant argues that it is more moral to act out of logical duty using reason than intentions of gaining something or avoiding something, whether materials or emotions. Doing something for the intention to avoid guilt or prison would not be considered moral by Kant. Kant argues that one should never lie, not in any circumstance. That it is because it is possible for one or a person to make this into a general principle. For example, if you had to choose between the following two principles: people should tell me the truth and not lie because I like people to be honest with me, or people should lie to me whenever lying suits them because I do not want people to be honest with me. Well, obviously I'm going to choose number one. I want people to be honest with me. Kant wanted people to use reason and logic to find principles that made the most logical sense. Okay, this next slide is going to sound a little complicated, but remember, the whole purpose of this is to simplify morality so that people at this time period do not need to be an academic expert in understanding biblical texts in Latin or having a priest interpret it for them to understand morality, but they can simply use logic to understand morality. So the idea is to make morality accessible to everybody through logic without needing to have a religious text or emotions to guide you into morality. Accessible to all. Okay, now this is going to sound a little complicated. Kant argues that it is a categorical imperative is an order or rule of duty that makes logical sense for all people to follow all the time, whatever the consequences. Kant contrasted these with the term hypothetical imperative, which is, as we discussed earlier, if you want something, variable X, or want to avoid something, variable Y, then do action A and B, but not Y and W. Kant wanted to make morality available to all people, meaning that you don't need to be an expert at empathy and you don't need to be an expert at understanding religious texts, which were often written in other languages like Latin. Ooh. What about a fusion? Okay, when you think of superhero comics that we put on the pedestal and call the superhero good guy, probably more Superman and Spider-Man, but to some extent Batman, they follow a code of honor like do not murder the villain but hand them over to the justice of the police system and process. And that code is more Kantian. Because if you're dealing with a psychopathic killer who's going to kill thousands and thousands of people like the Joker, and you are following utilitarianism, well, someone might argue that someone like Batman, a vigilante, might follow a darker past. But that would not make him a hero any longer if he did that. He would be an anti-hero or some other kind of vigilante, which we would find morally ambiguous. Why is that? Okay, here we go. Hedonism is a group of philosophies that value pleasure. Pleasure is the primary source of good and meaning. Aggregation is the process of combining separate pieces of data into a single, unified whole. Utilitarianism is a moral philosophy created by Jeremy Bentham, aka the greatest happiness principle. The basic idea is that the correct moral choice is the choice that will produce the most amount of pleasure or happiness with the least amount of pain. First, work out how much pleasure a particular action will bring about, taking into account how long, how intense, how likely this will give rise to future pleasure, then subtract any units of pain or harm or suffering that may be caused. If more pleasure and less pain is gained by a mild lie, then lying is the moral choice. Everyone's happiness was equal in Bentham's word. Everybody to count for one, nobody to count for more than one, no one gets special treatment. Some felt uncomfortable with Bentham's stress on equality. There is a counterexample, a famous counterexample. There's many famous counterexamples, but a famous one is the sheriff example. If the sheriff needed to frame some innocent person to prevent a massive amount of harm, like riots and murder, would it be justified? Something inside us goes, oh, that doesn't feel right. Wait a minute, doesn't feel right? Okay, is that logic or is that emotion? What's wrong with this scenario? Dig deep into this example and imagine your thoughts and feelings as you think about this process. Here's a video on the topic. We're not going to look at it right now. Okay, at one point, Hogan's Alley was home to more than 800 black community members and featured an African Methodist Episcopal chapel founded in 1923, a residence for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. All right, their community was devastated and destroyed for a highway. The highway may have increased the happiness of 100,000 commuters who got to get to work faster and enjoy driving on this highway. But was that ethical? Many people argue no, that was not an ethical choice because of individual human rights. Now, here's another debatable issue from the point of view of utilitarianism. Violent criminals being locked up with not enough due process so that some few innocent people might end up in prison. Is that justified to have a massive reduction in crime and an increase in happiness for an entire country? In this real world example, it's the country of El Salvador. What are the numbers that make sense to you? If it's 3 innocent people in prison so millions can be happy and live in peace, what do you think? What if it's 4 innocent people in prison? What if it's 5 innocent people in prison? How many innocent people should go to jail? One insight this led to was the way in which ideas we have already directly related to the time we live in and can't be fully understood outside their historical context. Heavily influenced by Kant's metaphysics, see chapter 19, Hegel came to reject Kant's view that noumenal reality lies beyond the phenomenal world, rather than accepting that noumena lie beyond perception causing our experience. He concluded that the mind shaping reality is just reality. There is nothing beyond it. But this did not mean that reality remained in a fixed state. For Hegel, everything is in a process of change. History and philosophy were entwined, and everything was driving towards something better. We make progress in thought by clash between an idea and its opposite. First, someone puts forth an idea, a thesis. Then this is met with a contradiction, an opposing idea, an antithesis or antithesis. From this clash of ideas, a more complex and refined third position emerges, a thesis. This process is cyclical. The thesis can now become the new thesis. We need to recognize the need for other people's freedom. Other people to be free. We need to respect each other's freedom. This is the core about how we can all truly be free. And I think you can see the logic if we live in a community of 100,000 people where everybody respects everybody's freedom, then everybody is more free. Schopenhauer, he was an extreme pessimist. Unlike Buddha and Kant, Schopenhauer was a gloomy, difficult, vain man. When he got a job as a lecturer in Berlin, he was so convinced of his own genius that he insisted that his lectures should take place at exactly the same time as Hegel's. This wasn't his greatest idea, as Hegel was very popular with students. Hardly anyone showed up to Schopenhauer's lectures. Hegel's, meanwhile, were packed. Schopenhauer later left the university. Schopenhauer's most important book was The World as Will and Representation. The world as representation means the world that we live in. Like Kant, Schopenhauer believed that there was a deeper reality that lies beyond experiences and that what our senses are able to. Kant called that the noumenal world. The will is aimless, or as he put it, blind. It isn't attempting to bring about any particular result. It doesn't have a point or goal. It is just a great surge of energy that is in every natural phenomena as well as in our consciousness. Act of willing things. Consider how plants grow and make leaves open and flowers. However, we should consider this hypothetical force as we make our decisions, that this force may be pushing us into choices that we don't necessarily want to choose. Schopenhauer on ethics and morality. For Schopenhauer, harming other people is a kind of self-injury. This is the foundation of all morality. If I kill you, I destroy part of the life force that joins us all together. Basic morality was based on compassion. People are not external to me. I care about other people because we are all united to either one community or part of a metaphysical concept, the world as will. Okay, first of all, let me explain the hypocrisy fallacy. For example, I might state that everybody should walk more, ride their bicycle more, ride the bus or train more, take public transit. And if we all walked more, this city would be a much better, nicer place, a better community. So I'm arguing we should walk more. And of course, tied in with that, the city should build some sidewalks that are better for walking. But I drive my car. I hate cars. I don't like cars, but I drive my car. So does that nullify my argument and an assertion that we should walk more and cars are bad? Maybe, maybe not. Now, first of all, some people like say, how dare you say cars are bad? I love my car. Okay, well, leave that aside for now. But the point is hypocrisy. Let's say if you don't like the car analogy and manage it's littering or taking care of the environment or something else, and someone says they should take care of the environment, but then they don't. Does that nullify the argument that we should all take care of the environment? Whatever the issue is, hypocrisy, does it, well, some people argue that it's a logical fallacy or a fallacy. It's not a really valid argument to say, ha, I got you, hypocrisy. But at any rate, with that in mind, here we go, something you should be aware of. On one occasion, an old woman was chatting outside his door and made him so angry that he pushed her down the stairs. Humans often make choices full of hypocrisy. You be the judge. You decide. Your opinion. You think about it. John Stuart Mill received an intensive, busy education directly from his father at home, with little to no time for play or recreational activities, with no friends his own age. So as utilitarianism went on in time, there were more and more counter-arguments and counter-examples looking at the aggregation of pleasure or harm. So in order to solve some of these problems, John Stuart Mill looked at the idea of pleasure having different weight to help solve some of these counter-arguments or counter-examples. And perhaps there were higher pleasures that were super significant. And they are so important that having a certain amount of suffering to attain these higher pleasures makes it worthwhile for some amount of suffering. For example, an athlete training to win a prize is going to suffer in their exercise routine. A couple quick vocabulary terms. Paternalism is when an authority implements rules to protect individuals from harming themselves, or the opposite of helping individuals have a healthy diet by forcing children to eat their vegetables. Mill's message also was the harm principle. Every adult should be free to do what they want as long as they do no harm to other people. John Stuart Mill did not like the government or the majority of people telling people what to do. He wrote in his famous essay on liberty in 1859 that he preferred individual liberty over paternalism. Pause the slide if you're interested and read a little bit further about the context of how he was writing this in Victorian England. Okay, John Stuart Mill thought that adults should be free from paternalism, but not children. Therefore, it's okay for children. So what about in schools? What about the government and government schools? Well, the pros of paternalism in a government school teaching morality: it could create a respectful and safe environment. It could help create and foster emotional well-being. Children can learn about common community values. Children need to learn about social skills as conflict resolution from somewhere. And children need to learn how to get along with each other in community and not fight with each other. So it sounds like there's a lot of good pros to schools teaching morality. But what about the cons? Well, some of the cons are risk of government over-control towards a fascist state, risk of indoctrination, difficult to resolve competing moral values, difficult to standardize because of different moral values, and some parents may argue that the government is violating parents' rights. Parents may argue that moral values should be taught by parents. In 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of the Species. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection has had a profound effect on how philosophers as well as scientists think about humanity. One result of this scientific theory was that it became easier than ever before to believe that there is no God. Evolution is a mindless process. It has no consciousness or God behind it, or at least it doesn't need to have anything like that behind it. It is impersonal, like a machine that keeps on moving. Charles Darwin used the scientific method, which places a huge emphasis on gathering empirical evidence through observations of either the natural world or experiments. Natural selection and the theory of evolution has had a huge impact on other philosophers and thinkers and government leaders and scientists. In addition, specifically, it's had an impact on philosophers thinking about morality as well. However, there's also a dark side. Natural selection, not Darwin himself, but his ideas influenced other philosophers and thinkers who wrote other ideas, who influenced other philosophers and thinkers. And then eventually things got edited and published and moved to places like eugenics and Nazi Aryan ideology. And so there's a dark side that you can look into. But with eugenics, well, at any rate, moving on, Google these topics if you're interested in these. We're going to go fast on this version. Soren Kierkegaard. Regine Olsen agreed to marry Soren Kierkegaard even though she was worried that he was too gloomy. Soren Kierkegaard wrote to Regine telling her he couldn't marry her and returned the engagement ring. He felt terrible about his decision and spent many nights crying in bed after that. She understandably was devastated and begged him to come back. Kierkegaard refused. Most of his writing was about choosing how to live and the difficulty of knowing that your decision was the right one. To what extent did Kierkegaard make the best decision? How might Kierkegaard's romantic relationship with Regine have affected his writings and decision-making? Decision-making is built into the title of his most famous work, Either Or. This book gives the reader a choice between either a life of pleasure, chasing after beauty, or one based on conventional moral rules. A choice between the aesthetic and the ethical. Okay, slow down and take a look at these slides if you're interested. I'm going to go really fast through this section. The textbook mentions that Kierkegaard spent many nights crying in bed after his decision to end his romantic relationship and engagement. This impacts some key ideas about being free to make this choice about your meaning and existence, but the consequence is potential regret. This idea of freedom continues to be developed by later existentialist philosophers. Perhaps either choice that Kierkegaard could have made could have been argued by some to be neutral, moral, or immoral, but the more critical question is, which choice do you want to live with for the rest of your life? Take a look at this slide. You be the judge. What is your opinion? But before you make your opinion, make sure you Google the terms cognitive dissonance and post-purchase dissonance. Read about those terms and understand those terms from psychology crossover, and then form your opinion about what you think. Okay, here are some of the questions to think about. You be the judge, form your own opinion, make yourself an educated opinion with the vocabulary in mind. All right. To what extent do you think Soren Kierkegaard really believed that he had made the best decision, or was he trying to convince himself that he had made the best decision? Number 2, if he really believed that he made the best decision, then why did he think about it so much afterwards? Kierkegaard was a Christian, though he hated the Danish church and couldn't accept the way complacent Christians around him behaved. For him, religion was a heart-wrenching option, not a cozy excuse for a song in church. In his opinion, the Danish church distorted Christianity and wasn't truly Christian. Not surprisingly, this didn't make him popular. According to our author, the author of our textbook, Nigel Warburton, she was his true love, and their failed relationship was the source of almost everything that he wrote in his short and tormented life. I wonder if Nigel Warburton's right about that. In the 20th century, however, his books became popular with existentialists such as Jean-Paul Sartre, who were particularly taken with his ideas about the anguish of choosing what to do in the absence of pre-existing guidelines. Okay, Kierkegaard, the stages, the aesthetic stage. Driven by sensory pleasures, novelty, and the avoidance of boredom, people in the stage live entirely in the moment, seeking out adventure, entertainment, romance, excitement, because they avoid deep commitments and long-term responsibilities. Now, the interesting thing here is that Soren Kierkegaard avoided the responsibility of getting married and having children and stayed single, but he did take on the responsibility of his career. And so he would probably argue that he chose to move to the ethical stage, focusing on the community and his career and the career impact that his writings would have on the community. Anyway, in this stage, Kierkegaard argues that moving to this stage of duty, responsibility, and principles requires a conscious choice. However, what if I was to assert that some people choose to pursue greatness and some people have greatness thrust upon them? Or what if I was to say some people are pushed, kicking and screaming into responsibility of parenthood where they don't want to become that responsible parent, but at some point they change their mind and choose to be responsible at some level? At any rate, the ethical stage is debatable whether you are having a conscious choice or you're forced into responsibility. But Kierkegaard says you make a conscious choice, and with the next stage, yes, it makes sense that you would make a choice to go to the religious stage and have a God focus. This is the stage characterized by the famous leap of faith. Now, if you are understanding that this is in the context of Soren writing a lot about Abraham and Isaac and the choice Abraham has to have faith in God, then it's an incredible, difficult choice. It's a choice that nobody wants to have them make in that story. And so, nobody's doing this by accident or not making a choice. The way that Soren is sort of saying that you are making a sort of a sacrifice of some kind and a suffering of some kind to step out in faith, in terror and in anguish. Okay, implications to ethics and morality simplified. Okay, regardless of whether you agree or disagree, or whether you are religious or agnostic or atheist, here are some interesting takeaway ideas. Your view of meaning or morality ethics can change over time. Other people's view of morality and ethics can change over time. Your choices may affect your own angst and despair. And angst and despair may exist for a season in your life, but this will change. Life is changing and not constant. Okay, some key terms to remember. Deontology. Deontology, the study of duty. Deontology and deontological ethical theories answer the question about what we should morally do with a focus on the input rather than the output. Duty, obligation, and perhaps intent are more important than the outcome. Consequentialism is an ethical theory holding that the moral rightness or wrongness of an act depends solely on the results or consequences. Solely or primarily, I would argue, but at any rate, either way. Virtue ethics is a major normative ethics that are focused on character rather than rules, duty, or consequences. Some philosophers describe virtue ethics as placing more emphasis on being than doing, but other philosophers would call that an inaccurate simplification, since virtue ethics are also trying to answer the question, what should we morally do? Moral sentimentalism, the theory of moral sentiments, is another way of phrasing that, hypothetically, maybe slightly different. Moral sentimentalism asserts that our emotions and desires play a leading role in the anatomy of morality. Morality is constantly being learned through social interactions and our emotions, such as empathy. For example, one day I hold the door open for someone walking in behind me, and I feel really good about that. And I want to have that feeling again. So I hold the door open for another person who walks in behind me, and I feel really good about that. And I feel rewarded by these positive emotions, teaching me a moral, ethical framework. In the same way, the emotions of guilt could also affect people's morality as they learn and experience through taking actions and feeling guilt and shame, or taking other moral actions and feeling generous and kind and empathy. All right, so there you have it. That is the end of this lecture. I'm sorry for this incredibly fast, rough draft. If you're watching the uncut version, there's a lot of uncut stuff left in the uncut version. All right, have a good night. One more thing I should ask for is leave some comments below about feedback about what I should do when I make a good copy of this video, how I should improve this video, if I need more visuals, or what do I need to do. This is the rough draft. And if you like the rough draft, like and subscribe. If you subscribe, you might see a future video with better quality and better sound. All right, like and subscribe. Leave a comment about what I should do to improve my videos or what you liked. Thank you kindly. Have a good night. Oh, also I should mention, if you found this helpful in any way, even a section, forward it to one of your friends and tell them to watch the section starting at the 30-minute mark, or whichever minute works.